guys, this is Taya with Mission, and today we'll be going about how to enable AWS Config in your AWS account. So, off the bat, what is AWS Config and what does it do? Well, AWS Config basically provides a detailed view of the configuration of AWS resources in your account. It'll tell you things like how the resources are configured and how resources relate with one another. Why would you want to use config? Well, when you run resources in AWS, you typically have to manage them. As your resources increase, it becomes more difficult to manage. So this is where config comes in and can be much more helpful. It can help with things like governance. It will help detect misconfigurations and notify you when things are being altered in your environment. It can help with, auditing and compliance. For example, it stores historical data about the configurations of your resources. How does AWS config work? So there's a lovely diagram here, and I would strongly recommend reading this whole documentation by AWS as it is very, very helpful. But here's this diagram in general. So when you first turn on AWS config, it discovers all the AWS resources in your account, and then it generates a config item for each resource. So whenever there is a configuration change in your AWS account, config will record and that's change, and then if it's normalized it will just store it in S3. And you can also set up things like integration with SNS to get alerts. Also, you can integrate it with Lambda to auto remediate that stuff as well. So that's one of the use cases for config, and this is basically just a summary of how it works here. Supported resource types. Config will basically support most of AWS resources. Here, AWS lists all the resource that it supports. Feel free to go and take a look at it. I won't bore you with going through each and every one of them, but it supports most of the basic things that most people use here. Also here we have service limits. So config works using rules. So basically what happens is you set a rule, and then that rule basically identifies what you want. Now here you can see that there are limit values. Most of them can be increased, but take note that some of them can be. So definitely take a look at that, and this will make much more sense once we get into the console in a little bit. Config. How do we set it up? So basically we're going to hop in the console in a little bit, but the summary of it is you specify the resource type that you want AWS config to record. This could be a VPC, this could be a S3 bucket, this could be an instance, and then you can also set up an S3 bucket to receive the configuration snapshots. Additionally, you can choose to set up Amazon SNS to send configuration to notifications to you as well. And without being said, let's hop in the console and get our hands dirty. Guys, as you can see here, we have the config dashboard. I'll go ahead and click view dashboard. As you can see, nothing's been set up here. So this is the config dashboard. You can go ahead and play with it. You have resources, rules. Nothing yet has been set up. So I will go to rules, click on add rules. Now there's a couple things that you can do here. You can use a AWS managed rule. You can use a custom lambda rule, or you can create a custom rule using guard. For here, I will use the AWS managed rule, and let's say I want bucket replication. So S3 bucket replication, basically I want this is going to check if my Amazon S3 buckets have replication rules enabled. The rule will say non-compliant if an S3 bucket does not have replication rule. We'll click on next. As you can see, the name kind of defines it, S3 bucket replication enabled. This resources all changes or tags, I will select all changes. Basically this means that when any resource is recorded by AWS config, it's monitoring it basically whether it's created, changed, or deleted. This we don't necessarily need this. I will remove this and we'll go next. Everything looks good here, and we can add role. So the role has been added here, and now what it's going to do, it's going to scan my AWS resource and see if we have any bucket that replication isn't enabled. And in a little bit it should show up with a list of all the resources that are non-compliant here. So you can kind of filter this non-compliant, compliant, or all. So we'll go to non-compliant and just wait for a little bit. So as you can see folks, it's telling me that I have 6 buckets that are non-compliant. Why? Because S3 bucket does not have a replication rule here. So you have six buckets that do not have any replication rule. And this can be done for much more. Let's say for example you want to monitor a security group. You can set it to watch, and whenever there's been a change to that security group, whether there's been a new ingress rule or egress rule, you can tell it to notify you. And the cool thing about this is remediation. You can click on rules right here, go here, actions, manage remediation. You can set it to automatic remediation if you so choose, or you can do manual remediation as well. I'm here, automatic. This is how you publish SNS notification. This says the remediation is it's going to send you a SNS notification. You can also choose to, for example, let's say you want to close the security group whenever there's been a change to your security group. You can do that as well. Automatically would do that. If you want to, you know, bucket version, and you want anytime there's been a bucket enabled that there's no version in, it can automatically make sure the bucket has version enabled. In this case, I do not want these buckets encrypted, so I won't do that. But for the sake of this practice, let's go ahead and click on one. Let's say bucket version in. Now, the only thing that you need to note is you need to give config the role to access whatever resource. In this case, it will be S3 that config needs to access. So I would create an IAM role allowing config to access it. And that's pretty much the summary of this. So it's a pretty handy tool that you can do, and you can create more and more rules. As you can see, we have one non-compliant rule, which is the one we created. We can always create new rules and create multiple rules. So it's just a fun way of managing your resources. And this is a very nice dashboard here as well that we can play with. And yeah, so that is config in a nutshell.